All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the first unit lecture. This is going to be on disagreement and trust. I'm going to try and make the video as good as possible. I'll probably stumble a few times, but just act like it's a regular lecture where I would stumble anyways. We're going to be talking about disagreement and trust today. There's the three articles I read, the really short piece by Honora O'Neill on trust, and then there were the two pieces that, as I said in my news piece, they're a little bit more difficult than the other pieces we were going to read this semester, but I do think that the basic lessons of those works are pretty understandable. So we can start with the more difficult pieces, and then we'll end by talking about the Honora O'Neill piece on trust and whether or not it's declining. And I hope you read that article. You could have also watched the video. It's just the transcript of the video that I posted online. So I want to start with disagreement and trust. It's not something that usually gets put into introductory philosophy classes. So please let me know if you think it was useful or if you think, it's too difficult or not particularly enlightening. But the reason I thought it would be useful to include is I think that, especially nowadays, we have so many interactions with people, whether it's through Facebook or social media or just in general, about controversial topics such as, we might disagree about politics, we might disagree about religion, we might disagree about whether or not we should take certain important life steps, or, there's a lot of disagreement in society, and navigating that disagreement is actually fairly important. Given that, disagreement is going to be common to any society that we look at, you're going to have disagreements with your family, with your friends, with people that you respect, people that are close to you. And those disagreements are often about really important things, such as, the existence of God, or what is right and wrong, or who to vote for the, presidential election or your local election. So I think that knowing how to handle disagreement is an important part of dealing with other people. That should say other people there. I'm sorry, I don't know why that doesn't. But anyways, it's an important part of dealing with other people because it doesn't seem right to just hold our opinions no matter what sort of arguments are levied against us from other people or what sort of evidence they present. But we also don't seem to want to just change our minds immediately when discovering that someone we respect or someone that we're close to disagrees with us. So there's this it seems like there should be this important middle ground that how we navigate our decisions such that when we disagree with someone, we importantly update on our own beliefs. And equally important is how we respond to disagreement is important to discovering answers about what the right answers are. So if there is a right answer to who to vote for president, part of discovering that is going to be handling our disagreement with other people. The same with the existence of God. If I disagree with someone about the existence of God and we think there is a truth to the matter of whether or not God exists, then we might think that somehow our disagreement might help us get closer to that truth by, giving our own evidence that we have, giving our own arguments for the position that we take, and sort of talking it out with someone else will help us to get to the right answer, or supposedly it might help us to get to the right answer. So I thought that we'd start with these two pieces on disagreement because I think it's a really interesting topic that doesn't get talked about at these introductory level classes, but I think it's in some sense more important than these discussions on these big issues because it's going to inform how we discuss those big issues and how we see our disagreement about those big issues playing into our own decision-making processes. And the piece on trust by O'Neill sort of plays into this because it's about how to locate trustworthy people in our society. How do we determine who is trustworthy and who is not? Or in other words, in the light of disagreement, how do we know which people we should, whose disagreement we should respect? How do we know people who we generally think are reliable or trustworthy, and how do we incorporate their disagreement into our own belief-forming process? So that's a short, introduction on why I included disagreement, why I felt it was important to include disagreement. But I'd be interested to hear if you guys think that that's something worth doing, or if it's, like I said, maybe a little too technical, or maybe too difficult, or not entirely pragmatic. So let me know what you guys think by sending me an email or something. That'd be wonderful. So first I want to introduce this concept of epistemic peers. We saw this being used by both both of the philosophical pieces by Fumerton and Christensen. The word epistemic comes from epistemology, which is the philosophical study of knowledge. So epistemology is the study of how we know things, of when we can say we know things, of how beliefs fit together and into a foundation for knowledge, or a coherent story about the way the world actually is. So the idea of an epistemic peer is someone who has roughly the same cognitive capabilities and epistemic virtues. So cognitive capabilities are things like they're maybe roughly as intelligent as we are. They're roughly as good at processing information as we are. Maybe they have the same access to evidence that we have. Maybe they're as vigilant about getting evidence. So when we read books and articles, we also think that our epistemic peer would likely read those books or articles, or watch that documentary program, or listen to the news, or whatever pieces of information or evidence that you're accumulating. You want to assume that your epistemic peer has access to those, or at least in principle has access to those. The epistemic virtues part refers to their level of honesty and level of freedom from bias. So we don't want someone who's going to be motivated to reason in a certain way such that they're going to come to a certain conclusion. So you might have those friends or people close to you that what they think on a given topic, and it doesn't seem like they're willing to properly examine the evidence. Maybe they're any evidence that comes in is going to be filtered such that they get to the conclusion that they want. So you want someone who has roughly the same epistemic virtues as you, or in regards to an epistemic peer, the person who's your epistemic peer has roughly the same epistemic virtues that you have. So they're about as free from bias. They're about as intellectually honest. They're about as good at, examining the evidence. All of these capabilities are roughly the same for an epistemic peer. You might think, well, maybe there really aren't any such things as epistemic peers. Maybe no one really is my epistemic peer, because it seems like for any of these capabilities or virtues, there's going to be a spectrum of degrees, right? So you might think that at the top of intellectual honesty, there are the people who are really just interested in finding the right answers. They don't care what the right answers are at all, but they want to find the right answers, so they're really intellectually honest. And at the bottom of the spectrum are these people who they don't care what the evidence looks like. They just want it to spell out the conclusion that they're looking for. So maybe someone who's very wed to their political party as a Democrat or a Republican, and for any news article that comes out against their party, they're going to filter it such that it gets to the conclusion that they want, that their party ends up looking good, or their preferred political candidate looks good. So the idea that there's these wide degrees on the spectrum might lead you to think that given how many epistemic capability or cognitive capabilities you have and how many epistemic virtues you have, it's really not possible for anyone to perfectly match up on any of those scales. So maybe the epistemic peer is too idealized. Maybe it's this sort of dream notion that doesn't actually exist in reality, and therefore it's not really pragmatically useful. Because if we're going to sort of map our disagreement onto these epistemic peerhood situations, if there aren't really any epistemic peers, maybe we shouldn't be asking that sort of question. And this is a response that you get to a lot of, it's sort of the response I had initially to this sort of literature about peer disagreement was, it doesn't really seem like there's anyone that's actually an epistemic peer, because for any of those qualities, I might share the same degree on one or two of them, but it's unlikely I'm going to share across that wide spectrum. I think that's actually right, that there's not going to be anyone that shares with you on all of those categories, but I don't think that's what we need for someone to be our epistemic peer. I think the key term in that epistemic peer is that they're roughly the same cognitive capabilities and epistemic virtues as us. Because, small degrees in intelligence or small degrees in intellectual honesty probably aren't going to be as dangerous or as significant as we might initially find them. So I think how we should think about this is that peers are someone who has roughly the same cognitive capabilities and epistemic virtues, because we think people that are smarter than us or more intelligent than us might actually get things wrong that we have right. And I think most people would agree that people who are less smart than us or less intelligent than us might also get things right that we end up being mistaken about. So I don't think it's fair to completely write off the notion of peerhood because someone can't fit us exactly on all of these capabilities or virtues. So I think when we look at these two articles, we need to take the concept of peerhood as a sort of roughly pragmatic view rather than this idealized view, which is similar on all the capabilities and virtues. So the first piece I want to talk about is David Christensen's article, Disagreement as Evidence. And it sort of begins as this nice intro piece that sets up the two views and some motivations for them. And then he goes into some of the further complications about conciliatory views in general. But I really wanted to use it for the sort of setup and the nice sort of way he describes what I take it to be the two most general views in how we respond to disagreement, and talk about those a little bit. So imagine we're in a situation where we have an epistemic peer and someone who's roughly the same cognitive capabilities as us and roughly the same epistemic virtues as us, and we're in a case of disagreement. So maybe I disagree with a friend who I think is as smart as me and about as cognitively capable as I am, and we do disagree about the existence of God or something. So what are our options how do I revise my belief about the existence of God in the face of knowing that my friend, who's my epistemic peer, disagrees with me? It seems like there's initially this motivation to be conciliatory. So that's one option that we're going to talk about, is conciliatory. Conciliatory just means to bring our belief closer to theirs. So in cases of peer disagreement, we should revise our opinion towards the opinion of the other individual. And we might think that there are various strengths of conciliatory positions. Some positions might not cause us to be terribly conciliatory. We might just have to revise our degree of belief a little bit. So I think Christensen gives this example of two doctors, and they each come to a prognosis with really high levels of confidence, like 96 or 97% confidence rating in their diagnosis. And when they're diagnosing this patient, you might think that, well, they don't really need to come that close to each other because their actual confidence levels are so close, and they end up agreeing. So there's this problem where it's not clear that either of them has to move very much. However, there are examples where we think that maybe both parties should move quite a bit. So we'll talk more about the various degrees of conciliatory views when we discuss it in detail, but that's one general approach to the problem of disagreement, is that we should revise our opinion towards the opinion of the other individual. On the other hand, and this is the view that we end up seeing Fumerton advocate, and we'll talk more about that when we get to his piece, but the other view is this view called steadfastness, or being steadfast in your opinion. So in cases of disagreement, one should just hold on to their own opinion. So when my friend and I disagree about the existence of God, the steadfast position would say, whatever your position is, you hold on to that in face of disagreement. So let's look at each of these and some of the motivations for these views, and see what arguments they give in favor of it. So the conciliatory approach gets its motivation from cases like mental math. So this is a case that Christensen gives. It says, imagine you're with a friend at a restaurant and you've each had your own meal, and when it comes to splitting, the check comes at the end of the meal and you intend to split it. So each of you look at the check and do some mental math calculations, and you come to different estimations of how much you each owe. Maybe you think you each owe 15, whereas your friend thinks that you owe 16 and he owes 14 or something like that. So you have these different estimations of how much you each owe. So in cases like mental math, when you say, okay, I think that we each owe $15, but my friend thinks that one of us owes 16 and one of us owes 14. who's more likely to be right? Well, if you think that your friend is your peer and they're as good as doing mental math at you are than you are, then you might think, well, maybe it's actually somewhere in the middle. Maybe we both got it wrong, because there's no real reason to think I did it right and he did it wrong, given that we did the mental math pretty quickly, and I think they're about as good as math as I am. There's no real reason to favor your own opinion over the opinion of your friend. So in this case, you might seem compelled to say, maybe we should split the difference. Maybe we should come somewhere in the middle. So maybe we each owe 15. One of us owes 15.50, and the other one of us owes 14.50, or something like that. So, given that we both think that both parties are equally likely to be right, it seems that we should move towards one another. Another case of that might kind of motivate this conciliatory view is this the statue case that Fumerton brings up. So he's talking about a statue that is in the middle of his alma mater campus, and he remembers it being a certain figure. I can't remember off the top of my head who it is, but let's just say it's George Washington or something. And he remembers it being George Washington, but he's talking to his colleague, Ernest Sosa, and Ernest says, no, it wasn't George Washington, it was Abraham Lincoln, or whoever he ends up saying it is. And Fumerton says, well, I think he's about as good as perceiving, a statue and recognizing who the figure is as I am, and he has about as good of a memory as I do, and we both spent, roughly the same amount of time on campus, and we're probably both roughly equally attentive to the statue being there and recognizing who it was. So maybe, we should be conciliatory in that position. Maybe I should say, if he thinks it's Abraham Lincoln and I think it's George Washington, I'm not really sure who is right. So maybe I should just withhold belief about who the actual statue was. If it came down for pragmatic purposes, we might adopt one position or the other for pragmatic reasons, like to be able to give an answer. But maybe in general, we should withhold opinion if we're able to in that position. So these are some motivations for the conciliatory position, is that if we really think that this person is our peer, then it's not clear that we should hold our own opinion, because if they're equally as likely to be right, then maybe we should meet somewhere in the middle, or maybe we should either withhold belief. Maybe we should be agnostic about whatever position we end up getting. So if this is an easy example, but in the case of where I disagree with my friend about the existence of God, if he believes in God and I don't, and I think he's my peer, maybe I just say, maybe we should be agnostic about God's existence, and maybe given that we're both equally likely to be right, maybe we should just both be agnostic about it. So those are some of the motivations for the conciliatory views. Let's talk a little bit about the steadfast views. So a lot of people are motivated to accept steadfastness for precisely the sort of reasons that I was talking about. Maybe we should be pushed to agnosticism about the existence of God in the face of disagreement. So I say, look, for any position that I'm going to end up taking, such as the existence of God or a political position, or even, everyday beliefs about like statues, for example, someone is bound to disagree with it. So even the most mundane beliefs, we might think that there are going to be disagreements about it, and disagreements with people that we take to be our peers. So steadfastness says, look, given that there's this widespread disagreement and conciliatory views counsel skepticism in the face of disagreement, we're going to be skeptical about a whole lot of things. We're going to be skeptical about who's on the statue. We're going to be skeptical about the existence of God. We're going to be skeptical about what political party we should belong to. We're going to be skeptical about, major life decisions. We're going to be skeptical about all of this sorts of stuff. And any position that seems to counsel widespread skepticism about a huge range of beliefs seems wrong. So maybe we should think about holding on to our own opinion, remaining steadfast in the face of disagreement. The problem for the steadfast position is to articulate a reason why we might be justified in being steadfast in the face of peer disagreement. Because if we genuinely think that people are our peers, then it seems like we're, for the same reasons that we saw in mental math and in the cases of, the statue, it seems like we should at least move our beliefs somewhat, given that they're equally likely to be right. So, proponents in the steadfast view have come up with a variety of different reasons. We're going to look at one with Fumerton. But another one that's not really talked about is maybe, well, it's talked about a little bit in the Fumerton, but maybe one reason to hold on to steadfastness is that we can sort of introspect about our reasoning process. So when we're doing the mental math question, I can, kind of think back to what I did in my head and how I added and say, I'm pretty sure I, got all of those basic addition functions correct. And I can't see into the, inner workings of my friend's head. I can't see what exactly they went through when they multiplied the checkup, but I can see my own, and I'm pretty certain that I didn't make a mistake. So maybe I, have reason to stick with my own belief. So this is one sort of consideration that gets brought out in favor of the steadfast position. But when we turn to Fumerton, we'll see another rather radical reason for maybe being steadfast in our beliefs that I think is pretty interesting. But that's one motivation that you might have to keep steadfastness. And the other, of course, that we talked about already is a sort of, conciliatory positions lead to this really widespread skepticism that seems to undermine almost all of our beliefs. And any position that does this has to be wrong. So maybe we have to adopt some sort of steadfast position. So the principle that Christensen identifies that divides the camps, and this is what sort of I talked about with that second motivation for that steadfast position, is this principle of independence. So this is a little bit technical, but independence is evaluating the epistemic credentials of another person's belief about P. So P is just any given belief that you can insert in there. So you could substitute the existence for God for P, and this statement would read fine. So in evaluating the epistemic credentials of another person's belief about the existence of God, to determine how, if at all, to modify one's own belief about the existence of God, one should do so in a way that is independent of the reasoning behind one's own initial belief about P, or about the existence of God. So this is the idea that for a conciliatory camp, this independence principle is going to look very attractive. They're going to say, if this person's my peer and I think they sort of have the same reasoning processes and the same sort of cognitive skill set that I do, when I'm deliberating about our disagreement, I shouldn't use my own sort of introspective process, my own introspection, or my own looking in at my own reasoning processes to deliberate about it, because that violates the assumption that they're my peer. Because I'm going to, they're going to have roughly the same sort of process or roughly the same sort of reasoning skill level that I have. So reasoning about that process when I'm trying to deliberate or arbitrate between the disagreement is going to be sort of either admitting that they're not my peer, or it's just not going to be something that I should bring into consideration. Steadfast views, on the other hand, seem to want to embrace this principle, or steadfast people want to actually deny this principle. So they want to say, look, part of what I have when I'm deliberating about this disagreement is my own introspection, or my own, I can look back at how I reasoned where I can't see into how my friend reasoned. Maybe the best thing to do in this situation is to assume that they made a mistake about reasoning, given that I can see my own reasoning process and it seems to be fine. So maybe I have to assume that if they have a different opinion than me, they've somehow been mistaken in their reasoning process. So this is the principle that Christensen sees dividing the two camps, and I think is very, it's a good way of distinguishing between the two camps. And it's a good way to determine how you feel about these two camps, is how you feel about the independence principle and whether or not we should use it when sort of arbitrating or revising our belief about in the face of disagreement. So the rest of Christian's article is a little bit technical, and it goes into some other consequences for the two camps. I'm not going to talk about that at length here because I don't want this video to drag on for too long. But I do want to note that there's some interesting ideas about how conciliatory views handle disagreement. So is it just another piece of evidence that we have? So maybe when we find out that someone disagrees with us who we think is our peer, maybe the best way to think about that disagreement is it's just another piece of evidence. It's not like a piece of evidence like a direct argument is, or an actual piece, like a physical piece of evidence, but it's a piece of evidence that we should consider when making a position. So there's these interesting concerns about how exactly we should handle disagreement from a conciliatory point of view. Like, should we always choose the middle ground, or should it be some slightly less degree of conciliatory, like how far we should move towards the other person given the type of question is. So maybe, in the doctor case where we're both really confident about our treatment, maybe we don't need to move very far. Or in the case of like, maybe my friend and me are both disagree about the existence of God, but we're both really unsure. So maybe we don't need to move much at all in that position, given how low confidence we have about that question. So there's always interesting relationships, but I don't want to talk too much about that because of this video will quickly spiral out of control, as I'm sure it has already. But let's talk a little bit about Fumerton's fun piece. I think this is a really cool piece. You can't trust a philosopher. And the irony, of course, is that Fumerton is a philosopher. And, we see this tension at the end of his piece. But let's talk a little bit about how he sets it up. So in the beginning, he says, look, there are some cases of epistemic disagreement that are just obvious. There are obvious cases where the disagreement should sort of defeat our initial confidence or our initial belief. So as we saw in the examples of mental math or statue, when we find out that someone disagrees with us, Fumerton thinks that unproblematically that these cases do suggest it should defeat our initial confidence. So we should revise to some extent, at least in both of those cases, because we have access to the same sort of evidence. We don't have any good reason to believe that one of us is going to be more successful than the other, and we think that we're roughly as capable. But he also brings up some cases that he thinks are problematic, that don't immediately suggest defeat. So one of these examples is the Monty Hall case. So I don't know how many of you have heard of the Monty Hall problem, but he explains it a little bit, but I think it's worth explaining in detail. The Monty Hall problem is this problem. It's a famous probability theory problem. And it says, okay, you're the guest on a game show. And your goal is to pick between three different doors, 1, 2, or 3. And your goal is to pick the prize. Behind one of the doors is a prize, and behind the other 2 are goats. And so let's say you pick one door, you pick door number 2. And the host says, okay, I see that you picked door number 2. I'm going to show you what's behind one of the doors. So he opens door number 1, and there's a goat behind door number 1. And he says, okay, now that I've shown you that there's a goat behind door number 1, do you want to switch from door number 2 to door number 3? Or do you want to keep your first choice of door number 2? And so the question is, should you stay or should you switch? So a lot of people intuitively, when they first hear this problem, they think, well, it doesn't really matter if I switch or not because I have the same odds either way. So the reasoning goes something like this. When I initially pick, I have a 1 in 3 chance and of door number 2 being right. And door number 3 also has a 1 in 3 chance of being right. So maybe it doesn't matter if I switch or not because they have the same probability of being right. But in reality, the actual strategy which is most effective is to switch. So if you want to be right, you should switch. And this is really complicated probability problem. So it's and I understand that a lot of people are going to be like, but no, it doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter. So I'll post a link to a YouTube video or something that explains it, but I wouldn't be able to do it justice here. But trust me that you should end up switching, or review the video or the tutorial, and you can see that you should switch. So, but the basic idea is that when people immediately, and I had this experience too when I was immediately presented with this problem, I thought it shouldn't matter whether you switch or not. They both have the same probability. But after being walked through the explanation of the Monty Hall problem and why people take that, or why people understand that switching is actually the right choice, will help you understand, it's sort of an enlightening process, right? We see where our previous reasoning led us to error, and then we sort of understand why switching is ending up being the right case. So Fumerton says, when I present this to a colleague or to a close friend that I consider a peer, and they say that it doesn't matter, their disagreement should not cause me to revise my belief. So the reason that he doesn't think it should cause us to revise our belief is because he's been in that person's shoes, and he's seen that the reasoning process, why saying it doesn't matter looks so attractive, and why saying it doesn't matter seems like the right choice. But given that he's sort of been walked through the right answer and has he has the process of coming to appreciate the right answer, Fumerton thinks, well, no, in these cases I shouldn't revise my belief. I should just know that they're mistaken, given that I made the same sort of mistake, and I can appreciate and understand why they made that mistake. So he says, problems like the Monty Hall problem suggest that maybe there are cases where we shouldn't, have defeaters or doubt our original confidence, even in the face of disagreement. So he comes up with sort of 3 criteria for when we can encounter disagreement without losing justification for our original belief. And I've listed them here, but the first one is we have good reason to believe that we have a different and better evidence base than the person with whom we disagree. So in the Monty Hall problem, they think maybe, they have a little bit of different and better evidence given that they've sort of been walked through the explanation or something. And if the second reason is maybe we have good reason to believe that we have engaged a common evidence base more successfully than the person with whom we disagree. So in the Monty Hall problem, maybe Fumerton thinks, look, I've engaged with this evidence. It's the same evidence base, but I've just engaged with it more successfully because, I've been walked through it in the proper way. Or 3, the other reason is maybe we have good reason to believe that the person with whom we disagree is cognitively defective. So this is the idea that maybe instead of thinking that we either examine the evidence better or that we have a different or better evidence base, maybe we should just think that this person isn't actually our peer in some important way. And we see a few of those cases. We'll look at them. So he thinks in cases of politics and philosophy, it's not at all clear that we can reject the disagreement on conditions 1 or 2. So it seems like people in intellectual positions or people that he would consider his peers probably have the same access to evidence. They probably read the same articles. They've been introduced to the same arguments for positions. Maybe they've even, had the same sources of the same evidence that they've been introduced to. So he thinks it's unlikely that we're going to be able to retain our beliefs on the grounds that we have access to better, different evidence. And in some cases, he even admits that maybe they even have more evidence. He doesn't think that having more evidence is going to settle a position, but he thinks it's perfectly plausible that people that are his peers have better access to evidence, and he doesn't think that it's likely to discount the disagreement on those grounds. The next consideration he says is it's probably not fair to discount the disagreement on the grounds that he's better analyzed or better reviewed the evidence either. So if he disagrees that they or if he agrees that they probably have access to the same evidence and the same types of evidence, he also thinks it's likely that they probably reviewed the evidence in the same way. They were probably, I mean, maybe not the same way, but to the same degree. They're probably just as good at evaluating the evidence as he is. So, they've done their due diligence. They've analyzed arguments just as he would have had he been in their shoes. So they're effectively his peers in that regard as well. So he doesn't think that 1 or 2 is very promising as a means of being able to retain our steadfast beliefs or retain our beliefs in the face of disagreement. So Fumerton's rather radical solution is to suggest, well, maybe these people are just cognitively defective. So maybe they're either motivated to accept a certain conclusion such that they reason incorrectly about the evidence that they're given, or there's some sort of important defect with the way that these people reason such that I can maintain my belief in the face of their disagreement by suggesting that they're cognitively defective. And he brings a few examples of this to bear with his rather vitriolic talk about political views. So he says, look, I realize that my own political views are really far right compared to academics, and a lot of academics are very liberal. So he says the fact that, I think that American foreign policy over the past century has been something that we should be on the whole proud of. And maybe the war in Iraq was justified, and we had a justified reason for going to war with Iraq. These are all going to be seen as very radical solutions. And he says, but look, I have some, I have some good evidence that people are motivated reasoners here, or that they're somehow cognitively defective, because some of the arguments that he's heard from them, he just says are just so poor. So he says, look, when I hear someone argue that we shouldn't have gone into Iraq because of how much of a failure it was, he says that wouldn't, normally for these people, that wouldn't be a very satisfying argument. Normally, we don't judge the wisdom of a decision based on its outcome because it's just impossible to know how it's going to play out. So we wouldn't, accuse a doctor of, doing a risky surgery. We wouldn't accuse the doctor doing a risky surgery of being wrong just because that risky surgery ended up, killing the patient. We would assess that opinion on the basis of whether or not it was the right thing to do from the doctor's point of view. So maybe the doctor said, look, this person's in a lot of pain and they're likely going to die anyways. The only way to maybe possibly, help them out of this situation is to give them the surgery. If that's right, then we wouldn't say just because that patient died that the doctor made a poor decision. So in the same way, given that the Iraq war was a failure, it shouldn't mean that the decision to go into Iraq was wrong for Fumerton. I'm being Fumerton here. He says that's a really poor argument for this. And I think that maybe he says this poor argument betrays a sense of motivated reasoning that a lot of these people are employing. Another sort of, he calls it the global reason for thinking that other people are cognitively defective. He says, look, there are these people that hold all these really bizarre and wrong positions. Given how many different philosophers, he has that amusing quote from Descartes that says something like, no position is too wild or too crazy for a philosopher to hold. And he's he's right. There are a lot of, radical and seemingly crazy positions in philosophy. And he says, when I figure out that someone who holds one of these crazy positions, so he gives this example of Paul Churchland, who is a philosopher of cognitive science at the University of California, San Diego. And he holds this position that there are no such things as beliefs or desires, or there are no such things as these cognitive states that we tend to think are very real. We tend to, when we explain, human behavior, we tend to talk in terms of people have beliefs and they have desires and they, these interact in some way, and that can explain people's behavior. So Paul Churchland has this position called eliminative materialism, which says like, no, beliefs and desires and all these sorts of cognitive states that we take to be real actually aren't. And Fumerton says, well, I think this is just an absurd position. I actually, breaking from Fumerton for a second, I'm not sure that the position is as crazy as Fumerton makes it out to be. And if you ate it, I would suggest researching on your own. But for the purposes of, this lecture, Fumerton thinks that this position is crazy. And he says, look, given that how crazy this position is, I think Paul Churchland's a smart guy, and I think and once I figure out he's actually being genuine about this belief. So, for instance, you might think he's just kidding, or you might think he's just holding it for some other reason, like he thinks that it's an interesting view to hold, and he doesn't actually think it's right. But once he finds out that, Paul Churchland is serious about this, or he thinks that it's the actual right view, Fumerton says, look, I'm out of resources to say why he's wrong, other than to say that there must be something defective about his cognition. Maybe he's motivated to accept a crazy position for some other reason, or there's some cognitive defect that Paul Churchland has that I don't when assessing evidence. And he's very aware that how egoistic or how much this inflates his own self-worth by saying, look, I'm not cognitively defective, but these other people, given their crazy views, they must be. But he says, maybe there is good reason to suppose this on the basis that given how wrong their views must be, given how many philosophers hold wrong positions, maybe I should just think that the majority of them are cognitively defective. And he realizes that by saying this, by coming up with this explanation for why his peers disagree with him, by saying that they're cognitively defective in some way, he says, well, look, now I've just traded out this really difficult problem of trying to understand what to do in the face of disagreement with an even harder problem of saying why I'm not cognitively defective, but all these other people are. So why shouldn't, if we think that Fumerton's right, and we think that we should generally not trust philosophers, or generally philosophers are unreliable, but like I sort of pointed to in the beginning, the irony is that Fumerton is a philosopher, so why shouldn't his reliability be called into question? So when you want to discount the disagreement with your peers by saying maybe they're not really your peers, maybe they're unreliable, then you run the risk of also needing to explain why you're reliable and they aren't. And it seems really odd to sort of say, well, I'm just more epistemically virtuous, or I just don't have the defects that they have. There does seem to be something unsavory about saying that, but now he's tasked with explaining that. And so it's just kind of an interesting consequence of this strategy to defend the steadfast view of retaining your belief in disagreement, is that you end up having to explain why you're reliable. So that'll do it for the disagreement part. I wanted to sort of point to these two views and some reasons you might flock toward either one. And in the discussion post, I want you guys to talk about which one you found more convincing. So head in there. I'm going to talk about Honora O'Neill's piece very briefly, but that'll do it for the disagreement. So as I said in the beginning, I wanted to include this piece on trust by Honora O'Neill because I think it has a lot to do with how we identify people as peers. So you might think that in order to identify someone as a peer, we need to be able to sort of properly assess how trustworthy they are or how reliable they are at forming true beliefs. So she's responding to what she sees as three sort of cliches that we need to dispel. The first is a claim, and the claim is that you probably heard this, but that we don't trust people anymore. No one trusts anyone, and we're all too skeptical about the intentions or beliefs of other people. We're not relying on other people like we used to. We can't just go up to other people and trust them that they're going to do or say the right things. She says, I'm not sure that this cliche is right. It's not clear how how we would measure the trust that's involved in society. But from opinion polls, it seems like the people that were highly trusted in past eras, like judges or nurses, are still really, they still exhibit high levels of trust. Where the people who are not very trusted individuals, like politicians, or she says journalists, which I found odd, but these people that are really untrustworthy are still pretty untrustworthy. The majority of people find them untrustworthy. And it seems like people that we would meet randomly on the street are somewhere in the middle, which makes sense. We're not really sure what to do with them, given that we don't really know anything about them. So she says, look, all of these sorts of metrics that we have about people's opinions about really trustworthy individuals or non-trustworthy individuals, it all seems relatively similar. So she's not sure that this claim is actually right. But then she takes another cliche, which is like an aim or a goal that a lot of people say. So they say, once we have this claim that, trust is gone in society and we don't trust people enough anymore, the natural next step of that is to say we need to trust people more. This is something we need in society. We need to be able to trust people. So her response to that is, she calls it a stupid aim. She says, we don't need to trust people more. What we actually need is to trust the trustworthy more and be skeptical of the untrustworthy more. So it's not that on the whole we should just be trusting people more, but rather we should allocate our trust properly. So we should trust the people that actually deserve it, and we should be skeptical of those who don't. So it's stupid to think we should just amplify the trust in society and that we should be able to trust everyone, but rather we should be trusting the right sorts of people. And she gives sort of three rough qualifications for that, like their honesty, their capability, and their reliability, or something like that. But she says, look, these are the three criteria that we should be judging people on. And that's how we should allocate our trust. We shouldn't just needlessly amplify the trust in our society because of some perceived lack, but rather we should be finding out who the trustworthy people are and trusting them. So it seems like a pretty commonsensical way to respond to this cliche. And the last cliche she wants to respond to is this task. So people say, given this claim that we don't trust people anymore and this aim that we should trust more, the task is that we should rebuild trust. So we should, start trusting people more generally. And this will be a way that we could sort of rebuild or gather more trust in society by rebuilding ourselves. So we should start trusting people individually more. And as you might guess, Nora O'Neill thinks that this is the wrong way to go about it. It's completely backwards. We shouldn't be rebuilding trust as individuals. What we should do is be building our own trustworthiness. We should aim to be people that are worthy of other people's trust. And part of doing this is giving other people a track record of our decisions. She gives this example of, in order for her to trust this clothing store, they have this policy of what you can return the socks and we won't ask questions about why you returned it, and you can either exchange it for a pair of socks that you prefer, maybe a different color or a different fabric, or you can just get your money back. And O'Neill says, look, the fact that this organization or this corporation makes themselves vulnerable by giving me the ability to just return my socks, I trust them that they're giving me a high quality product. So I'm more likely to purchase from there. She says it's this act of making themselves vulnerable by saying you can return it if you don't like it, that grants her the ability to trust this corporation. And she briefly gestures at some ways that we might do this, by making ourselves vulnerable by saying, look, if I don't, fulfill my obligations, or if I'm not right about this, then, I'll make myself vulnerable to you in some important way. So you can hold me accountable for being wrong. And she says, doing stuff like this is what we should do to rebuild trustworthiness rather than rebuilding trust. So it's not that we should aim to go about trusting people more blindly, but that we should give people cues that we're the type of people to be trusted and then sort of fulfill that promise. So by making ourselves vulnerable, or by giving someone a track record of our past success and failures, we can sort of rebuild this trustworthiness that's going to allow people to properly allocate their trust among people. So this is, I saw this fitting into the disagreement piece because I think that part of knowing how to respond to disagreement is also knowing which people to trust, or which people are generally reliable. So I think Honora O'Neill's, sorry, that name's so hard to say, but Honora O'Neill's piece provides us with a nice roadmap of understanding that. So sorry this is a little bit long, but that's all I have for the first unit. Go ahead and take that quiz and do the discussion board post. But hopefully this was helpful to you all, and thanks for listening.